Acadia National Park is one of the most visited national parks in the United States, seeing more than 4 million visitors each year. The park is made up of 47,000 acres of land managed by the National Park Service in Maine. Its location on the coast and the border between northern coniferous and southern deciduous forests makes the park a home to unique ecosystems from intertidal to subalpine. For 12,000 years before Maine and Acadia National Park came to be as we know it, people of the Wabanaki nations inhabited the land. The 4 tribes, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, that make up the Wabanaki Alliance have a long history of fishing, hunting, foraging, and trading within the current area of the park. When confronted with displacement attempts by European colonizers as early as the 1500s, they remained resilient and have shaped the history of their people and the park in the face of colonial attempts at removal. Now, they live all throughout Maine, and the tribes have a government-to-government relationship with Acadia National Park, including the nearby Abbie Museum, a native-guided museum of Wabanaki history, art, and culture. The Acadia area was settled by homesteaders and fishermen, and by the 1820s, farming, lumbering, fishing, and shipbuilding were major industries on the island. Around the turn of the 20th century, Mount Desert Island became a popular retreat for prominent people like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, who built elegant estates throughout the island. George B. Dorr, a conservation spokesman in this time period, dedicated his life to preserving the Acadian landscape. Disturbed by the growing development of the Bar Harbor area in 1901, Dorr established Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations, whose purpose was to acquire and protect land for use by the public. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson created Sieur de Mont's National Monument on the land they had collected and gifted to the government. In 1919, Dorr's dream of a national park came true, as President Wilson signed Lafayette National Park into existence, whose name was changed to Acadia National Park in 1929. The creation of the park was not contested, and while there were no evictions of Native people for the direct purpose of creating the park, the Wabanaki had been forcefully scattered and displaced by European settlers in the mid to late 1700s. The areas that make up Acadia were singled out for protection for many reasons. They contain many important landscapes, are host to plant species on the edges of their range, and are located on the Atlantic flyaway, making them a refuge for migrating birds. Acadia is also special for its rich cultural and historical significance. It's the first national park created from gifted private lands and the first national park in the eastern U.S. Acadia National Park is categorized as an IUCN Category 5 protected area. This makes it a protected landscape. This is likely due to its vast coastal preserves and unique landscapes. Some of the threats that Acadia has been facing include air pollution, overvisitation, and non-native invasive species. Acadia is downwind from many cities and industrial areas, and polluted air from these areas often becomes trapped in the park due to the park's geography. There are several ongoing projects to manage air pollution and its effects on the life and landscape of the park. Acadia is one of the most visited parks in the U.S. It holds the most public coastline in the Northeast and is one of the largest public areas in the region. The park is working to ward off the effects of overvisitation by restoring landscapes, repairing historic sites, and spreading awareness about leave no trace principles. As a park with a lot of coastline, Acadia boasts many wetlands, islands, and bluffs which are home to native species of plants, mammals, insects, and birds. The presence and spread of non-native species has been one of the biggest threats to the park's ecosystem. Acadia National Park is the steward of many different landscapes, including marine, mountains, and forests. An often overlooked area of the park, though, is the 20% that is made up of wetlands. Acadia's wetlands support diverse wildlife and plant species, including some of the most rare plants found in the park, which have disappeared in other parts of Maine. The plant communities found in these wetlands are well adapted to local conditions, which is what makes the ecosystem so productive. Some of the most invasive species in Acadia are Lytherium salicaria, purple loosestrife, and Frangula alnus, glossy buckthorn. These plants are densely growing and produce large quantities of seeds that remain viable in the soil for years. They outcompete native species such as cattails and push out native plants that many mammals, insects, and waterfowl rely on. Acadia National Park has seen quite a few dramatic changes resulting from climate change. The temperatures both on land and water have increased by 3 to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the past century, and the intensity of both droughts and precipitation events have been increasing. The growing season has been increasing in Maine over the past century, which puts quick-growing and reproducing species such as loosestrife and buckthorn at an advantage. Acadia has also seen a decline in native plant species. Overall, climate change increases the risk of invasive species spread and viability in the area, and it rapidly changes the environmental conditions that native species have adapted to over thousands of years. Both purple loosestrife and glossy buckthorn were introduced to the U.S. intentionally over 200 years ago. Loosestrife was introduced as an ornamental plant in many gardens and for use by beekeepers. Buckthorn was introduced as a decorative plant to create hedgerows and create wildlife habitat in forests. These introductions were ultimately caused by values and attitudes which put the beauty and usefulness of non-native plants over the danger they pose to the local ecosystems. It was also caused by the lack of awareness of the impact that these plant species were having on native ecosystems. Wetlands have historically been seen as wastelands. Many of Acadia's were dredged, ditched, or filled in before the park's establishment. This has fragmented and polluted wetland communities, leaving native species struggling to survive. Comparatively, invasive species are often characterized by their ability to thrive in highly disturbed areas such as these. The two main planning tools used by the National Park Service and the state of Maine to manage invasive plants are monitoring and evaluation procedures and planning legislation. Acadia has an integrated pest management plan which goes into detail on the biology, locations in the park, and recommended actions to manage each species of interest. This plan recommends managing glossy buckthorn by cutting the stems and applying glyphosate to the stumps. It recommends managing purple loosestrife by using long-term use of herbicides combined with public education. Acadia's pest management team surveys the areas in the park to monitor growth and new infestations. They have found that the actions taken based off this plan have been successful, as the amount of glossy buckthorn has reduced from 0.54 acres to 0.05 acres in the Great Meadow area from 2016 to 2022. When it comes to planting legislation, both purple loosestrife and glossy buckthorn are on the Maine noxious weeds list, meaning that they are illegal to sell, buy, import, or propagate for sale within the state. This legislation has been successful at reducing the presence of these species as ornamental plants, which is the main way they've been introduced to new areas. The key management principles found in Acadia's approach to the invasive species threat are: in dealing with threats may require long-term activity, shifting baseline syndrome, and effective environmental planning processes are necessary to combat threats to protected areas. Dealing with threats may require long-term activity. The only way to deal with plants as aggressively invasive as loosestrife and buckthorn is through long-term management. They're all over the park and they're not going anywhere, so it will take a long time to manage them to a point where the native species are competitive with them. Shifting baseline syndrome. From an article on the Acadia National Park website, quote, "Invasive species are never going to be eradicated. They are part of the human-altered world we live in," end quote. 1 out of every 6 plant species on Mountain Desert Island have been lost since the 1920s when the park was founded. And they've lost so many plants to climate change and invasive species that there's no way to realistically get them back, and there's no way to eradicate all the invasive species that outcompete native ones. Acadia recognizes this reality and has procedures to judge what areas should be restored to their previous states, what those previous states are, and what areas are to be unrestored and kept in their novel form. Effective environmental planning processes are necessary to combat threats in protected areas. Acadia's general management plan and integrated pest management plan include thorough plans to deal with invasive plants in the park. Having a thorough understanding of these plants and planning on how to control them is important to combating the invasive species threat. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned more about Maine's unique national park.